What's up, everybody? My name is Joe Brown, and this is Heresy Financial. If you haven't seen already, on Thursday, lawmakers arrived at a deal that will suspend the debt ceiling crisis until December 3rd. Now, this is a short-term stopgap measure. It doesn't solve the problem that they're trying to fix. It just delays it, basically. And so now, instead of that deadline being October 18th, they push it back a little. Their deadline is December 3rd. And so in this video, we're going to talk about how they did that, why they did that, and then we're going to speculate a little bit to talk about the flip side of what would happen if by chance, one can dream, if they were not able to fix this and the United States does actually default. Because in past videos when I've talked about this, I've discussed the negative consequences of what would happen should they default on their debt. So in this video, I would like to focus on the potential positive consequences for the society, for the economy, for the country, if that should happen. Ready? Let's dive in. First off, I want to thank you guys so much. I really appreciate every single one of you who's been around from the beginning, everybody who's new. I just recently hit 100,000 subscribers. Ultimately, 100,000 is just a number. It's meaningless. It doesn't change anything with the channel or anything like that, but it does give me one of these cool silver play buttons. I'll be getting that in the next couple of weeks, and I'll be hanging it on the wall behind me. So again, thank you to all of you for making that happen. All right, so lawmakers have arrived at a short-term deal. This is a stopgap measure in order to delay the debt ceiling deadline into December. Before this, October 18th was the drop dead date where Yellen said the Treasury would run out of emergency funding, and now this new measure will increase funding. It'll raise the debt ceiling temporarily by $480 billion. That will get them, that'll be enough money to get them to December 3rd. Now, if that date rings a bell for you, it should, because that is also the date in which the government will shut down. That's when they delayed the government shutdown. It was supposed to be September 30th. They came up with a solution last minute before midnight. So December 3rd is now the deadline for both running out of emergency funds and defaulting and government shutdown. Now, there's a lot of political maneuvering going on here, and so basically, the Republicans, still same story. They're trying to force Democrats to shoulder this burden, mainly because they don't want Democrats to be able to pass some of these large spending bills that they want to pass. But ultimately, there's still going to be a lot of political maneuvering between the two parties before we get to that December 3rd deadline. Now, in the past, when I've talked about this, I've mentioned how the debt ceiling was put in place in order to stop the government from being able to spend as much as they wanted. And that's partly true, but there's another side to that story. Now, at that point, there wasn't a debt ceiling, meaning there wasn't a pre-approved amount that Congress could just borrow until they hit that amount. Instead, every time Congress wanted to borrow, they had to pass individual legislation for each bond issue and the amount. And so at that time, it was much more difficult for Congress to borrow. But they were looking at this and saying, hey, we've got an opportunity to be able to spend more by borrowing more, and every time we have to go through this process, it's just fences we have to step over. So let's do something called a debt ceiling, that way we can just borrow up to that limit and we don't have to worry about passing new legislation each time. So while from today's point of view, the debt ceiling does impose a little bit of hindrance on government spending through borrowing, at the beginning, it was actually a way to give Congress the ability to spend more. And just as the debt ceiling was introduced sneakily as a way for Congress to be able to borrow and spend more, in the same manner, I believe it's inevitable, eventually the debt ceiling will be repealed in an effort to allow the government to be able to borrow and spend more. Now, I would like to correct a second thing that I've been talking about regarding this debt ceiling issue, and that is the economic destruction that would be caused as a result of a default. And again, I've said from the very beginning, I do not think the government will default. Even if it gets down to the very last day, just a couple of hours before the deadline, one way or another, they will figure out a way to spend more and raise that debt ceiling or suspend it and not default. However, in the off chance that the political polarization or the game of chicken goes a little bit too far, and that happens, what I've been talking about is how treasuries are the foundation of the global financial system. And there would be a big crash, a big collapse as a result, both in bonds, in the dollar, in stocks. It would be pretty devastating. But what I haven't talked about so much is how that devastation devastation or that economic crash would be very, very short term. And the long-term result of that would be absolutely fantastic and wonderful and cause a lot of wealth to be rebuilt and grow as a result. There's an article on Mises.org about why Americans would benefit from a government debt default that I will be sending out in my free weekly newsletter. And if you're not signed up for that, you can do so in the description below. But this article is fantastic and it goes into some details as to why America and the economy would be much better off if government spending was reined in, which it absolutely would be after a default. Because to be honest, a debt ceiling increase only allows the government to continue to hold its noose around the economy. If the government were to default, it would completely break that hold that the government has on the economy, and the economy would be freed up and a lot of resources would be freed up as a result. And the reason why is this: the government can only spend a dollar if it's taking that dollar from somebody else. Now we know this is true because there are only 3 ways the government can get income. Number 1, they get it from taxes. Very clear, they take a dollar from somebody or a corporation in the form of taxes. Very clear that that dollar they got from somebody else. Number 2, from borrowing. Again, very clear they got this dollar from somebody else. Grandma loans money to the government. She's free to do so. It's voluntary, so at least it's not involuntary like taxes, and that money came directly from somebody else. But the third way looks like borrowing, except it's not funded directly, voluntarily. It's funded via monetary expansion by the Fed. And in this way, every dollar the government spends that is funded by borrowing, that is funded by the Federal Reserve's monetary expansion, is siphoned purchasing power from all savers, all dollar holders, the entire system. It's purchasing power, it's inflation. So it looks like prices are going up. What's actually happening is all of your dollars are losing their purchasing power because that purchasing power has been transferred to the government as they spend money into existence. So why does this matter? Well, we know that government income can only come as a result of siphoning purchasing power away from the economy, whether directly through taxes or direct borrowing or indirectly through monetary expansion. Every dollar the government gets in income comes from the economy. The second reason this matters is because what they do when they spend that money. And by definition, the government spends money on things that the free market wouldn't spend money on, at least right now. Therefore, it is less profitable by definition for society than what the free market would have done with those resources by itself. So why is this the case? Well, it's because of the way that the free market allocates resources. It's going to automatically dedicate all of its resources to the places with the most profit opportunities first, and once those profit opportunities are taken up, those resources will then be allocated to the other areas that are potentially less profitable. Just like water running downhill, it's going to fill up the lowest places first, and the more water that comes in, then the higher and higher that water will go. So profit opportunities are going to be filled up with money first, and then it'll move into the lower and lower profit opportunities. This is in stark contrast to the way that top-down centrally planned systems direct their resources, direct their funds, governments allocate resources, which is just agenda-driven. And in fact, the only places that governments direct resources are precisely the areas in which the free market hasn't done so yet. Otherwise, there would be no reason for the government to direct resources in that area in the first place. Take the example of pizza. You don't see the federal government chomping at the bits to deliver a national pizza system that will deliver pizza to anybody in 30 minutes or less. The reason why is the free market already has pizza pretty much figured out and pretty much nailed. There was a profit opportunity there. Free market individuals realized they could dedicate their resources there. There was demand, there could be supply, there's a profit opportunity, and it solved the problem. And so there's no government coming in and trying to replace the free market in pizza. Instead, the government allocates its resources to things that the free market doesn't want to touch because the government looks at that and says, oh, well, nobody's solving that need, so we need to. Well, no, the reason why nobody was solving that need is because it didn't probably need to be solved as much as some of the other problems that people were already solving by their free will. Take student loans, for example. The free market didn't want to divert their resources to students with no assets, no job experience, and no income at low interest rates so that they could go to school and then potentially get a job and maybe be able to repay that later. And if they did provide loans for that, they were sky-high interest rates. So the government steps in and lo and behold, they offer some really great rates on student loans. So what happens? everybody suddenly has a degree, and guess what? They're worthless. And now everybody has hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loans, and they work as bartenders. That's the definition of a misallocation of resources. Now, I know I was exaggerating there, but the fact of the matter is the free market will solve problems that it can that have the most profit opportunity, and any of those other areas that the free market is not already solving will by nature have less profit opportunity at best, and at worst have a wealth destroying effect, which means that every dollar that the government spends, number one, they're taking away from somebody who would be doing something else with it instead if it hadn't been taken away, and then they are redeploying it by definition into an area that is at best less profitable for society than it would be otherwise, and at worst destructive to wealth. So what are some real numbers here? Let's say the government defaulted on their debt. What are the results of that, and what would they be required to do? Well, number one, they would not be able to take on any additional debt. They would only be able to spend money that they were able to get from taxes, which means that instantly government spending would plummet. Would there be a sharp economic contraction as a result of this? Short term, yes, but private GDP would soar because all of those resources, all of that money would be able to be better spent and be freed up for the free market for private individuals and corporations to decide how to deploy in a way that made sense to them. A recent study by the Phoenix Center showed that a 5% cut in the federal regulatory budget would result in $75 billion of increased private sector GDP and 1.2 million jobs annually. Further than that, the elimination of just one federal regulator grows the economy by $6.2 million and creates 100 private sector jobs every single year. So the fact of the matter is that a default on debt would break the stranglehold that the government has on the economy and would reduce the government's ability to siphon purchasing power away from the economy and deploy it into areas that are at best less profitable than the free market would do by itself, and at worst destructive to capital. And just like the removal of a tumor on a body which doesn't provide any health benefits and siphons resources away from the body, so should we be dreaming of the day that we see a reduction in the government's ability to siphon resources away from individuals and corporations. And finally, there's still time to sign up for the Market Disruptors live event in Miami on November 12th through 14th. I'm going to be there. This event Mark Moss is hosting. There's going to be a ton of heavy hitters there like George Gammon and Brent Johnson, Gerald Celente. I would love to see you there, meet some of you guys in person, have some drinks with you. It's going to be a fantastic time. Love to see you there. So if you'd like to join me there, sign up. I've got it linked in the description below. As always, really appreciate you guys. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.